we have reached a point in the application where we have to start reconsidering how we manage state. Now, in this section, I'm really excited because we're about to cover Redux. If you've looked at the React ecosystem at all, you've heard this being spoken about almost extensively and constantly because it's such a huge and integral part of not only React development history, but also it's a humongous part of how apps are built today and how they have been built for the last 2 to 3 years. Now, before we actually start writing any Redux code, we have to understand some fundamental concepts of Redux, but also why we need a solution like Redux. So in order to understand why we need the solution, we have to understand the problems that it's aiming to solve. Now, in this lesson, I'm going to try and explain to you where the problem comes from in our existing app already. So, where it begins is let's look at our app component. So anything related to when our user that we just built and authenticated and stored in our database and then store in our state is all kept on our app state inside of our top level app component. If we wanted, for example, to pass this current user into the header component as we already have, we just pass it to the header. But let's say inside of our header, we had a cart component, and that cart component for some reason needed the current user. So if we were to imagine that we had some cart component nested in here that needed current user as well, we would be passing current user from our header, which gets it from the app. But if our header component did not need the current user, and only our cart component needed it, but our cart component was still nested inside of our header component, then we would have to drill that prop down from our app into our header before finally passing it from our header into our cart. This style of drilling props down from components into their children is a bad pattern because the props in between, those components in between, don't actually need that prop. Only the child needs that prop. And potentially the child of the child is the only one that needs that prop. So let's look at a diagram and see how this looks. Let's say we have these squares that represent components. And the further they go down is where they're nested, right? So this component is a child of this component, which is a child of this component, which is a child of this component, before finally being a child of our app component. So our app component stores the state of the current user on its local component state. If our header component had a cart component inside, as we just demonstrated, that needs the current user, well, we would be passing it from our app component to our header component before our header component finally passes it to our cart component. But what if our cart component was also being used in a different section of the application, right? And in that application, it's even deeper nested. So there's a page component, some component, and some other component before finally reaching the cart component. We see that we would end up passing our current user down 3 to 4 components that all might not even need the current user. And in that sense, this component suddenly now has to consider that it might get current user as a prop, even if that component gets used somewhere else and cart component is not even a child of that component. We have to write our code suddenly to be flexible and have these conditional props just because there's a chance that cart component is a child of one of its children. We can see how that makes our code way less reusable. And just in order to make it reusable, we have to add these sudden conditional properties. That makes it so that this parent has to be aware of its children's component, props, without it really being necessary. Now, one way that you might be thinking that we could remedy this is, what if we were to take this state, right? And this component did mount, all this code that gives our current user current user data to be stored on this component. And what if we moved it into cart component, right? Because cart component needs current user, so why don't we make it so that cart component's also listening for the current user, right? And then they store the state locally, and then that would avoid this problem. Well, the issue with doing it that way is now that anywhere where we have that component, that cart component, it suddenly has its own state of the current user. And that current user might be reused in app state, header, cart component, and then this cart component, right? And other components. Not only are we repeating the code, which is bad, but we're also having multiple states of the exact same current user data. And that is bad, because if any of them are misaligned, if the current user data here is different from the current user data here, but then that's a problem, because now they're supposed to be referencing the same object. What this is it conflicts with our concept of unidirectional data flow. Because with unidirectional data flow, we always want the state to be the single source of truth. We want one state, in fact, to be the single source of truth. That's why we were putting our current user in our app component, because we would still just pass it through, right? All of our components. So is there a way for us to still get one single source of truth of where we keep all of the data that any component needs, but then directly have our component access that data? We can do that. And that's what Redux aims to do. Redux aims to be the single source of truth of where we store data that might be used in multiple parts of the application. And then we should be able to access that data from just that component without having to go through all of this prop drilling. Now, this is how the concept of Redux works. We have these components that compose our application, and they get props. The components then fire actions. And those actions could be anything. They could be triggered from user clicks, right? They're essentially, as they sound, they're actions. These actions then update the state, the way that we do set state, right? We have actions that trigger set state inside of our components. But instead of setting local state, what if we set a single piece of state somewhere else, right? Where any component could access. Well, that is what Redux is, right? Redux has that state not in the local component, but somewhere where any component can access it. And those pieces of state are called reducers. So, for example, any state regarding users, like our current user that we're currently storing on our app, would be in a user reducer, which is just a piece of the state or a slice of the state. Anything related to our shop items, for example, that we need to display would be in a shop reducer. And then anything related to our home, if we had, like, say, our directory items, would be in a home reducer. And they all combine together into one big object, right? One big state object called the root reducer. And then from the root reducer, when the components need those pieces of state in order for them to populate and display their views, we would pass that state into those components as properties, right? As the props that they need to display in order for our components to function the exact way that we've been writing them. And this way, all of our state and all of that information is stored in one object, one place. And it still flows in one direction. And it follows, if you remember our diagram, of our unidirectional data flow. Except this is now the state, this represents our views, and these are the actions. We're still getting unidirectional data flow. And by doing this, we also avoid that issue of prop drilling. Now, this is all conceptual, but how will this actually look in the application? Well, let's tackle that. But just always, if you need to, refer back to this diagram. We definitely will be as we continue writing our application and integrating Redux.